thank you all, and thank you, Kathy and others, for organizing the discussion this evening. I must say it's exciting to me to see so many people turn out for this sort of meeting. It's terribly important that people are engaged in this process, and this is a good start. I'm going to begin with a bit of history. Sorry, I think I'm hearing a little feedback here. Because I think that there are lessons that were learned in the promulgating and monitoring of the Millennium Development Goals that have a bearing on how we move ahead with the Sustainable Development Goals. And listening to Kathy, the idea of a coordinated, sorry, not Kathy, Minh-Thu in this case, beg your pardon, the idea of a coordinated worldwide effort to reduce poverty or to increase education or to improve health might seem perfectly obvious. You have sort of grown up with that. But let me tell you, it wasn't so obvious 10 or 15 or 25 years ago, and it wasn't easy to get it started. Now, I would say the first lesson that we should all keep in mind from the MDGs is that no matter how far off you set a deadline, it will arrive, perhaps sooner than you expected. And if people haven't forgotten what you resolved, then there will also be an accounting that you have to make, which is one of the reasons we're here tonight, here in the penultimate year of the MDGs. So you might want to ask yourself, where do you think you will be, and where will the world be 15 years from now? I think it's very hard for any of us to form that vision. We have to act a little bit on faith as we go forward and be prepared for some surprises. But the MDG story begins a little bit like Star Wars, a long time ago in a land far away. And in fact, it was in 1990, and it was the first global conference sponsored by the UN on Education for All in Jamtien, Thailand. And the EFA, as it came to be known, set a pattern for global conferences and summits. The delegates at Jamtien declared that by 2000, all children would be able to complete a full course of primary education. That was the headline resolution. There were many other resolutions. Everybody went away promising they were going to work towards this. And by 2005, there had been a succession of conferences and summits. 1992 in Rio, the first conference on environment and development. 94 in Cairo on population and development. 95 in Copenhagen on social development. 95 again in Beijing on women. And all of these conferences produced declarations of goals and targets to be achieved. But even by 2005, it was clear that many of these important goals were not going to be achieved in 10 years or 15 years or whatever the deadline was that had been set for them. And I don't want to imply that, that there was any kind of false promising here, or that the resolutions coming out of the summits were simply forgotten or ignored. They were very important to everyone who participated in the meetings, but they somehow lacked both top-level political support, and they certainly lacked popular awareness. So while the delegates from the education ministry may have gone home and said, oh, this is good, when they turned around and talked to their higher political officials and said, we also need money for this, well, maybe a little bit came along, maybe not much came along. And pretty soon, the goals themselves began to be a little bit embarrassing. But something unusual happened. In 1996, the Development Assistance Committee of the OECD compiled some of the most important goals and targets from the UN conferences, arranged them under 7 topics, and challenged both the bilateral and multilateral aid agencies and their developing country partners to take these so-called international development goals seriously and to use them as a demonstration that development assistance, foreign aid if you will, can in fact produce results. Now somehow seeing all these goals in one place incited interest and also some controversy. For some stakeholders, especially in the NGO world at the time, the adoption of these goals by the rich country club in Paris, called the OECD, tainted them, made them, in fact, suspect. And even though countries had signed on to them at each of these conferences and summits, there was a reaction of, why is this being imposed on me from the top? We didn't decide on these. We just signed the document. We didn't actually decide on them. So they had a rocky start. But in fact, with the addition of an 8th goal that was titled Partnership for Development, which is really another set of commitments reflecting other UN resolutions, the IDGs, the International Development Goals, became the framework for the MDGs. And that's what was adopted at the Millennium Summit by the UN in 2000. And I think that did allow most parties, in some ways, to reclaim ownership of the goals. They were adopted unanimously. Most countries were represented at the Millennium Summit by their head of state. There was really not much way to wiggle out of that. But it still did not ensure that those goals would become universally recognized as a global development agenda. And it has taken, over the years, many people and many institutions working together to promote the MDGs to ensure that when 2015 arrives, there will, in fact, be a record of progress that we can point to with some pride. We have been successful. We haven't achieved every single target, but we can measure the success. We can measure it in lives saved, in school years accumulated, and in improvements in people's lives. So the other part of the story I want to tell here, and leading into the SDGs, is from my perspective as an economist and statistician. Because among the groups that got most interested in the IDGs and subsequently MDGs were the statisticians and collaboration across agencies that led eventually to the establishment of the Partnership in Statistics for Development in the 21st century, known as Paris 21, the Interagency and Expert Group on the Millennium Development Goals, the Marrakesh Action Plan for Statistics, which provided broad-based support for improvements in statistics in developing countries. And this work has continued up now until the release just a few weeks ago of the Secretary General's report on the data revolution called A World That Counts, which you can find online. The work of the statisticians also drew attention to the need for major improvements in the national statistical systems of many countries, and that work also continues. So a few more lessons from the IDGs and MDGs. Despite their origin in these conferences, they were not universally embraced. Passing resolutions and taking ownership are two completely different things. To stay on track, leaders at every level must continually demonstrate their commitment to the goals. Otherwise, their followers lose interest and wander off to do other things. The IDGs and the MDGs have been described as a development agenda, but they are not a complete development program. They tell us what we want to accomplish. They don't tell us how. They were primarily, and I might be stepping into some controversy here, but I would say that they were primarily a communication tool used for conveying the need for and the successes of development programs to a general audience. Keeping them simple and short improves communication. But no matter how simple the goals, implementing a global monitoring regime, so now I'm only talking about the statistics, I'm not even talking about how do you achieve these goals, but just monitoring them and maintaining it over 15 years is itself quite difficult. And as you've heard, the proposed SDGs are far more complicated than the MDGs, and they involve many more players. There are more goals, more targets, and they will require a quantum increase in the national and international effort to produce and disseminate reliable, timely statistics about them. Now, we've heard a lot recently about a data revolution. And there is perhaps a too quick assumption that the data revolution will somehow solve the problem of measuring the SDGs. As a child of the 60s, I must say, I'm pleased and surprised to find myself surrounded by all these calls for a revolution. But a lesson that we learned on the streets of Berkeley and here at Columbia is that revolutions succeed and fail in very unpredictable ways. You can prepare for a revolution, you can encourage a revolution, we can even try to shape its course, but it is an oxymoron to say that we can plan for a revolution. The original call for a data revolution came from the high-level panel of eminent persons who were asked to propose a post-2015 development agenda to follow on from the MDGs, what has now emerged as the SDGs. And in their report, they said that a data revolution was needed to draw on existing and new sources of data to fully integrate statistics into the decision-making, promote access to and use of data for, I think I've scrambled the quotation, and ensure increased support to statistical systems. So basically, we need new sources of data, we need to use them for making decisions, we need to promote access to those sources of data, and we need to increase support for the statistical systems. So this call for a data revolution can be seen in two contexts. First, the recognition that despite more than a decade of progress in improving statistics used to monitor the MDGs, many developing countries still lack the capacity to produce and use statistics to carry out the functions of government. Not just to report to the UN, but to carry out the functions of government that they're charged with performing in their own countries. And furthermore, many countries do not make statistics freely available to their citizens or to anyone else, so there's no independent check on their performance. Second, there is a technological revolution underway that is producing vast streams of data along with new computing power and new statistical techniques to exploit them. They may be used for public or for private benefit, and it is essential that developing countries have the opportunity to use these new technologies. So as data revolutionaries, here's what I think we need to do to reach the SDGs. We must rapidly expand the capacity of poor countries to produce and use reliable statistics. This will require substantial resources from donors to support the poorest countries. We don't yet know how much, but the costing exercises are underway. And whatever it costs now, it must be sustainable in the long run, which means it will also require domestic resources. We need to liberate the existing stock of data, surveys, censuses, and administrative records, and make them freely available to all. Data are public goods, and they must be treated as such by governments and other public agencies. We must innovate. We must take advantage of new technologies to produce new kinds of information that are needed by governments, businesses, and by civil society to meet the challenges of the 21st century. We must share our resources and knowledge widely so that we don't create a two-tiered world of the information rich and the information poor. And finally, we must try to ensure that the SDGs are really measurable and that the results are reported widely. So one final thought on data revolutions. They tend to shake up establishments. I could quote a lot of lines from Bob Dylan and other troubadours of the 1960s to that effect. So until recently, and this is where we come up across one of those barriers we're going to have to work our way around, most statistics were controlled by official statistical agencies. They're not used to working out there with freelancers, with people who have large databases and big computers, and they simply start crunching numbers away. I think we're going to see a change in the modes of production for statistics. But I don't think that that excludes the national statistical offices. It's their challenge to adapt their processes, to take advantage of the new technologies in order to answer the kinds of questions that the SDGs will pose. At the same time, and I'll just wrap up by saying, so it invites some questions later on, I don't think that big data, if that's what people hear in their head, when we say data revolution, I think a lot of people think, oh, he's talking about big data. I'm not. I'm talking about all those other things that also have to happen. And I don't think big data provides the all-purpose solution to monitoring the SDGs or building better and more just and fair societies. It's a tool. If it's used well, it will help us. It could also be used badly and could harm us. And we will still have a need for the exacting, sometimes tiresome work that traditional statisticians have done to build up the knowledge base that we're currently working from. So, thank you.